Hey everyone, how's it going? Matt here, and today we're going to be talking about the new Lethal Weapon TV show. Is it good? Is it bad? Well, we're going to discuss that. First, I want to start off by saying I'm a huge fan of the Lethal Weapon movies. All four of them, as a matter of fact. I loved every single one of them. I can watch them whenever they're playing on TV. The first one actually holds a special place in my heart because it was like, one of those action movies you grew, or at least I did, growing up in the 80s that would always play on TV, and you'd get to, as a kid, before you're able to go see PG-13 or R-rated movies, I'd get to sit there and watch it on public television and just enjoy the heck out of it, even though it was edited down. But it's kind of funny because the Lethal Weapon movies are actually so influential in how action movies have developed over the years since the 80s. I can remember when I was in film school, I actually studied these movies, and basically the idea here is that Shane Black, the guy who wrote the Lethal Weapon films and who's gone on to be, a director in his own right, basically he took the odd couple comedy trope and smashed it together with the 80s action movie tropes, and you got something that completely changed the way action movies were made. It injected a lot of humor into the situation. It created a kind of buddy cop genre in and of itself. And if you look at Shane Black's movies throughout the years, you'll actually see that he carries this whole odd couple buddy cop thing on throughout pretty much every movie he makes. If you look at something like The Good Guys, it's Russell Crowe and what's his name? Ryan Gosling together, and it's basically the same Lethal Weapon formula. Same thing with Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, The Last Boy Scout, which Damon Wayans was also in, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And it's basically a very tried and true formula. A lot of other movies and stuff like that have taken this kind of odd couple trope and used it to great effect. Films like Tango and Cash, even stuff like the TV show Castle. All this stuff is basically the odd couple smashed into a cop backdrop in an action movie format type thing. So it's not a big leap to take that to television. And the question here is whether or not it's done successfully, because just like it can be done well, it can also be done poorly. And judging from just the commercials and the trailers for this show, you would think that it's a bad show. And it is. The Lethal Weapon TV show is a bad TV show. I will say this, though. Despite the fact that it's bad, it is immensely fun to watch. And it's hard to reconcile those two things, because I really want to hate this show. Any show that's produced by McG is usually extremely hit or miss. It tends to go towards the bad side. Occasionally he has, breakout ones which are pretty good, but for the most part his stuff is very schlocky. And you can tell from the premiere episode of the Lethal Weapon TV series that it's pretty schlocky. There's a whole set piece based around this racing, this Formula One racing thing that's going on in LA, and it's just so shoehorned in there, and it's a typical McG thing where he's like, oh, I want to do something with the Formula One racers, so I can hang out with them or whatever. It's kind of like what he did with his Charlie's Angels movies, where he just shoehorned in all this stuff that he thought was cool, so he could, do it, and it made its way into the movie. And you kind of see some of that here, but thankfully that doesn't exist much outside of the pilot episode, which he directed and had a personal hand in making. So I really want to hate this show, and I sit down, I'm 3 episodes into it now, and I sit down each time looking for stuff to dislike about it. And there's plenty there, but at the end of the day, I have to admit, I'm having fun with it. I'm enjoying the show. And the reason for that is because of the odd couple pairing that they've done. So, the new Martin and Riggs are played by, let me see, I got this right, Clayne Crawford and Damon Wayans. And this is the crux of the show, because if Martin and Riggs don't work, the show doesn't work. It's not Lethal Weapon. It's just some, generic cop action show on TV. And that's what made the movies work so well, is you had a very charismatic Mel Gibson and a very kind of down-to-earth Danny Glover, and they had great chemistry together. Every time they're on screen, they would just play off of each other really, really well, and that's the thing that carried the movie, in addition to the really good action sequences. And, there was also a very well-written crime story involved in there, and it was very inventive, and it played against tropes, and, played against expectations, and it ended up becoming a classic. This TV show is not a classic. It doesn't do what the movies do, in the sense that it's a very kind of like safe, episodic cop show where, you have like the case of the week, and it usually devolves into them stumbling upon some type of, drug organization and having to, engage in some acts of extreme violence. And then by the end of the episode, everything's okay. And so in that respect, it's very unoriginal. But the chemistry between Crawford and Wayne is good, surprisingly. I'm not a big fan of Damon Wayans outside of his work in Living Color, back in the 80s, because he was brilliant in that. But everything he's done since then has been, I talked a little bit about The Last Boy Scout at the beginning of this, and I think this show is more a Last Boy Scout remake than it really is kind of like a Lethal Weapon thing. Simply because I feel like the characters are a little bit more in tune with the characters from Last Boy Scout than they were with the original Martin and Riggs. But their take on this is starting to grow on me. Crawford, plays this down home Texas wild card guy. It's basically the exact same backstory from the movie. He was ex-Special Forces, went into the DEA. His wife died. In the show, his wife was pregnant when she died, so he lost his wife and his daughter. And so he kind of transfers out of Texas and goes to LA, and he's suicidal, he's very depressed, and the only thing he really has to, wake up in the morning to is his job. And we find out in the show that his wife's father is like the LA district attorney, and this guy cares for Riggs, so he pulls him out to LA to kind of, keep him from drinking himself to death or committing suicide or whatever. And he's also the guy who shields him and the Danny Glover character from all the destruction they cause, which is kind of like a cool take, because these guys, Martin and Riggs, they're running around, they're having shootouts in the middle of LA, they're having car chases, they're causing all this destruction of public property. And there's this funny gag where the kind of beleaguered police chief is like keeping a running tally of how much property damage they've done in terms of dollar signs on this little whiteboard. And typically they'd be like, oh, these guys would be suspended after the first episode of this, but because the district attorney has an affinity for Riggs, he's kind of protecting him, and that kind of gives the show its justification narratively to allow these guys to go crazy. And the Damon Wayans character of Detective Murtaugh is very similar to the one that we see in the movie. He's an older guy, he's a family man. In this one, he's not close to retirement, but he's had a heart attack, and so he's kind of on medical leave in a sense, and he's thinking about retiring, and everyone's kind of pressuring him to retire. But he's such a hardcore police officer, he's a guy who really loves the job and believes in it, that he doesn't want to retire just yet. And so, despite the fact that he's got a heart condition, he goes back to work, and he's paired up with Riggs. And it's basically the same setup as the movie, where you have the straight man and the wild card paired together, and they conflict with one another, but they're also bonded over their sense of justice and their professionalism to the job. And so when these two get into sync, they're really in sync. And when the pressure's kind of off and they're just kind of left to their own devices, there's some fireworks there because they play off of each other, where Riggs is kind of like the guy who antagonizes Murtaugh and vice versa. But then again, they're also learning about each other. So as Murtaugh learns more about Riggs' history, he begins to sympathize with him, and as Riggs begins to see Murtaugh's kind of domesticated life and his family, and sees the kind of thing that he could have had with his wife, he begins to kind of see why he should go on living. And, it was the exact same thing in the movie, but it's being stretched out over the course of this series. And this is one of those cases where if you look at the characters in this show, they're really the thing that's carrying this narrative, because the show itself is not very good. The stories aren't very original, and there are huge leaps in logic when it comes to these things where, police procedures is kind of like thrown out the window. But the one thing this show has done very well is establish its characters. Even the peripheral characters, like the police chief, the coroner, those guys are pretty interesting. And I'm looking forward to see what they do when they start introducing someone like Joe Pesci's character from the movies, and maybe even Chris Rock's character somewhere down the line. So that should be really good. And I think what this show really needs is an overarching season-long storyline that has to do with some type of criminal organization, and something that these two characters need to investigate and dig deep into. Because that was the thing that really made the movie stand out, was that one case that they kind of fall into and get into all these misadventures over. And against that backdrop, their friendship forms. Because this is a really good show in the sense that the characters have a lot of room to grow, and they're a lot of fun to watch, and the chemistry's there. Damon Wayans, there was a part, I think it was in episode 2, where his wife has invited Riggs over to dinner, and Damon Wayans goes through a lot of trouble cooking ribs, and he's very prideful about his ribs. He's like, these are my ribs. Like, they're fall off the bone ribs. They're good. And he does a lot of work for him, and Riggs kind of gets drunk at a bar, gets into a bar fight, doesn't show up. And so Murtaugh is, very upset because he put a lot of work into these ribs. And he even, when he confronts Riggs about this, he's like, man, I made these ribs. These are great ribs. And Murtaugh's like, dude, I'm from Texas. Like, it's like, I know good ribs. And by the end of the episode, they go out for a drink, they get drunk, they both get into a bar fight, and they kind of stumble back to Murtaugh's place, and the leftover ribs are in the fridge, and they both just kind of like drunkenly eat them. And it was a great scene in the sense that you had this wonderful bonding moment between these two guys where they both kind of get drunk, stumble home, and like eat ribs. And after all that kind of like build up to that, and at the end Riggs is like oh, these are good ribs. So you get these moments with these two characters which are just amazing, very good, very fun, very natural. The chemistry's there, and I think that as the show progresses and finds its feet and they develop these two characters more, you're going to get to see a lot more of that, and that's what's going to carry the show, and eventually they'll find their footing in terms of what the story of the week is going to be or what have you. So that's my hope. It could just, go completely wrong in the opposite direction, and the characters become dumb and stupid, and the stories get worse, and the show crashes and burns. I kind of hope not, because there is a spark there. There is something that makes this show worth watching. So, is it a good show? No. Is it a fun show? Yes. Should you watch it? Maybe, if you like this kind of thing. I'm watching it because I'm a fan of the movies, and I'm interested to see where it goes. So hopefully you guys found this video interesting. Let me know what you think of the new Lethal Weapon TV show. I'm not going to be doing probably a episode by episode commentary on this thing, but I will probably do something about it once the season's over, just kind of see where it went. But it's, in my opinion, it's worth checking out. If not, just to hate watch the show, for a couple episodes. But if you're like me and you love the Lethal Weapon series and you're into these characters, it's worth checking out. So anyway, guys, I look forward to talking to you later, and I will see you in the next video.